Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Oxford University Press and Center for Policy Research, I welcome you all to this warm and wonderful gathering. May I request our panelists and the author to be seated on the stage. Suhasini Haider, who's going to moderate the session today, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, and of course, the star of the evening, Zorawar Daulat Singh. May I now request the pleasure of Yamini Iyer's welcome address. Yamini Iyer is the president of CPR. Thanks.
Dr. Ansari, Mr. Gautam Mukhopadhyay, Dr. Shankar Menon, Suhasini, Zorawar, ladies and gentlemen. It's with great pride that on behalf of CPR, I can welcome you today to the launch of Zorawar's book. Zorawar's book in more ways than one illustrates CPR at its best. We pride ourselves in the fact that not only are we policy wonks, engaging regularly in policy debates and discussions, but our policy engagement is anchored in deep scholarly research. And the book today is just one of many illustrations of the nature and quality of scholarly research that we do. CPR's work on international relations, especially over the last decade, has in fact spearheaded, I would say, a new way of thinking about researching international relations. We've spearheaded work, historical work on looking at India's foreign policy and drawing from that historical work to understand foreign policy at present. This is a mode of thinking about foreign policy and foreign policy debates globally and particularly in India that I think is extremely relevant and extremely important, but far too underdone. And so we have had the privilege of some of the country's finest scholars who have worked in this tradition and produced some of the most relevant field-defining books. And Zorawar's work is a continuation of this high-quality tradition. I hope that this is only the first of many such scholarly works that give us a deeper and more meaningful historical understanding of the roots of India's foreign policy, the roots of our statecraft, and from there begin to understand and interpret how our policymakers engage with the globe in today's contemporary times. Thank you very much to all of you for taking the time to be here, and especially to Dr. Ansari for agreeing to give the keynote address and being our guest of honor. It's a real privilege for us to have you here, sir. And may I please welcome you to come on stage and give your opening remarks.
Pretty full house. Friends, for once, here's a book in which references are as footnotes and not endnotes. To somebody like me, it makes life much easier. Dr. Zorawar Daulat Singh's study is of Indian foreign policies, in plural, during the Cold War as an international system that extended from 1945 to 1989. He has developed an analytical framework to examine them in two phases depicted as peacemakers and security seekers. The case studies are illustrative. Arne Westad, in his seminal History of the Cold War, asserts that if there was a Cold War wild card, it was India. Nehru, he concludes, was repelled by it as an international system and was fiercely opposed to the concept of power blocks. This came out vividly during Nehru's discussions with President Truman in 1950, and the latter's remark, and I quote the remarks, that Nehru has sold us down the Hudson. And his attitude has been responsible for us losing the war in Korea. No other Indian leader has earned such a left-handed compliment in Washington. Though another one was subjected to remarks that, to quote Westhead again, oozed racism and misogyny. The book traces diligently this and other crises of that period in Nehru's concept of India as peacemaker with a preference for an ethical statecraft relying on persuasion rather than coercion. He brings out in chapter 2 contradictory elements between the ideals and principles of a policy of peace, as also the imperatives of a crisis in the immediate neighborhood. Some of these debates have a contemporary relevance. A complex judgment on Nehru is unavoidable. His focus was on the avoidance of war and on the furtherance of cooperation to India's benefit and retention of policy choices in an age when power bloc politics tended to predetermine them. He sought to accommodate this approach to the imperatives of power politics that were thrust upon him. The end result was a visionary who also possessed the requisite traits of realpolitik. Nuances are discernible. A case in point is Churchill's telegram to him, a telegram of thanks dated 1st of July 1953. And it said, "Thank you for the help you gave us over Egypt and Israel." At the same time, while describing the British action a few years later over Suez as worst case of aggression, Nehru advised President Nasser after the war to refrain from deporting from Egypt British and French nationals and persons of Jewish origin. This advice was not taken. Indira Gandhi confronted a different set of situations. The book's analysis of the Vietnam War brings out the conflicting forces in play. The author concludes that it gave credence to a credible independent posture that kept India in the game and prevented it from losing strategic support from either of the superpowers. New archival material adds greatly to the book's analysis of the Bangladesh crisis and the policy debate in New Delhi. It shows how a demand for regional autonomy and its reflection in an electoral verdict was turned by a neighbor into a tactical gain and a wider strategic benefit. The critical decisions were taken early. The Pakistan Army's crackdown on March 25 was followed by Indira Gandhi's speech in Parliament on March 31 and early diplomatic initiatives directed at foreign powers. The effort was to define the crisis in terms of denial of democracy and human rights and its resultant implications for India through the massive inflow of refugees into our country. The process involved seeking the support of one great power to counteract the possibility of a third power intervention in favor of Pakistan. This was undertaken successfully. And the author's conclusion is that Indira Gandhi was motivated primarily by realpolitik reasons aimed at giving India a free hand in the neighborhood. I conclude with one last observation. Foreign policy anywhere is about promotion of national interest, which includes threats to national security and perceptions of it in domestic politics. The latter necessitates a complex exercise. The annual reports of the Ministries of Defense and External Affairs routinely focus primarily on external threats. The Home Ministry's report, on the other hand, has a typology of 4 threats. 1, terrorism in the hinterland. 2, left-wing extremism. 3, cross-border threats, principally in J&K. And 4, insurgency in the northeast. Most of these are domestic and are of a socio-political nature, and their persistence sheds light on grievances relating to governance in its local, regional, and federal manifestations. I hope that this very erudite panel would shed some light on this also, since it inevitably becomes an input into power and diplomacy. Thank you.
Most important.
All right.
So why don't you come in?
Yeah, please. So much of protocol. I thought I'd forgotten all about it. No, let me do it.
Do a good job. Oh, so once they're wrapped properly,
Yes.
we don't have to struggle.
Thank you so much, and Mr. Ansari, with his keynote, has in fact allowed me to jot down a few extra questions, which I will get to. The truth is that in common parlance, and these days it's particularly common, our first Prime Minister tends to come in for so much discussion when it comes to today's foreign policy. That it was almost, when I saw Zoravar's book for the first time, I sort of felt almost a sense of relief. Because in the last few years, I've actually gotten, become more and more confused about what actually happened. The narratives and the counter-narratives, and neither of them is necessarily completely wrong. It's just the perceptions are so polarized that it is possible to start doubting everything one has ever learned or one has read, even if you're reading the first Prime Minister's own works. So Zoravar's book does not disappoint over there. The truth is that he has been able to somehow, sort of step back from what he's writing about and give you cold-blooded evidence for everything that he does. I do think he has shown his own interests and his own preferences for one style over another, and I'm going to ask him about that. But I do want to start by asking you, Zoravar, as you've become this kind of man who came in from the Cold War, if you like, what really prompted you to try and pit the two, if you like, against each other? The fact that you say right in your introduction that Nehru is always seen as an idealist and Indira Gandhi was always seen as a little more hard-nosed. That seems to me the driving force of the book, that you do want to show how neither of them were actually understood quite right. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. So, thank you for that introduction. So, I would say the biggest sort of driver for writing this book was, I think until a few years ago, we've been socialized into believing that the ideas that came into being after the post-Cold War period were going to be the sole guide to India's strategic future. The changes that we have, however, seen in the last 5-10 years have changed or just tossed those assumptions completely out of the picture. This notion of an unbalanced unipolar world order, as if we look back now, or certainly we're going to look back, will actually be an interregnum between eras or orders that were far more normal when you look at them. Multipolarity, bipolarity, distribution of power. So I felt that if we are going to now look at where India is heading, let's go to a sort of a longer span of history. So the challenge then was what conceptual framework, or what is the main driver of India's foreign policy right from its origins. We've always been told this idea of non-alignment has been this driver. But when you step back and you see there's been so much variation despite saying that I'm non-aligned, that I'm independent, I'm strategically autonomous, one could trace at least 4 different versions of non-alignment up till this day, including the current foreign policy. So we obviously can't rely on that as the sole framework. So I said, we need to start looking at the personalities and the major players at the time. So what made my job a little easier was, for better or worse, we were at a time where the executive dominated the geopolitical scene in India in the sense that it could set the agenda, set the ideas, shape how India is going to relate to the rest of the world. Quite unlike what we see in the last 20 years, where you have multitude of interests feeding upwards. So, and then it really comes down to who are the players in the period that I've covered. So I had to stop. Ideally, it would have been great to see even the end of the Cold War, but archival documents, evidence does not allow us to look at that extent of scrutiny. So the other proposition that I wanted to evaluate was, we've again been grown up with this idea that Indian realpolitik only emerges after the late 90s somehow, or after the second end of the Cold War. Suddenly crossed the Rubicon thesis. And yeah, my good friend Professor Raja Mohan, actually, for whatever you may say, he's set out a template that has dominated how we think of India's foreign policy. So I went there not so much to challenge it, but to have a critical conversation with that particular narrative, that everything that preceded 1991 or 98 is somehow woolly-headed, idealist, and unthinking, and or just been simplified into polemical caricatures. So I said, let's open that up and see what actually happened. And then and of course, the second shadow that has dominated how we look back at the Cold War is this dominance of China. As we've been told that it is always about China. India's foreign policy is China-centric, which is complete false. It's not at all true. In fact, if anything, what I discovered was, yes, China was there, but India had such a more complex and sophisticated worldview, quite unlike, again, in recent years, where you let your foreign policy be dominated by one single actor in the international system. So I said, so my conclusion is, of course, that Indian realpolitik has a rich tradition. We may not like Nehruvian geopolitics, but it had a certain logic and template to it. What was that logic? It was that this Asia that's come into being after the Second World War is facing an extraordinary power transition, similar to the one we are seeing today. China has re-emerged after a century of humiliation, your largest neighbor. You have the Americans literally on top of the world, 50% of global GDP. They are striding the Asian scene. So what do? Do you pick sides? Do you help aggregate power of the stronger side? Do you go along with the communists? You couldn't do that. But you said that a stable Asia needs stability between these two great powers. Of course, there was asymmetry. So Nehru goes out and he does this. We've been told that he does this for a long time, and we've been hearing his rhetoric and discourse. We've been grown up with it. But Nehruvian geopolitical practice has never been studied as much. So I wanted to bring it out and show that. And of course, then when you go into the 60s, we see, in fact, Indian realpolitik flourishing to a point which is simply astounding when you look at what our policymakers at the top are doing. They're looking at balance of power strategies. They are securing their periphery. They may be using means that may be unpalatable to their predecessors and maybe some of our contemporary liberal thinking. But they went ahead and they perceived India to be under threat. They found Nehruvian ideas were not sufficient to protect India, and they went out and did it. Isn't that what realpolitik ought to do? So I felt like the larger picture might tell us where the world is going and where India might have to navigate those, even if the circumstances have changed, even if interdependence is a big factor today, even if we're in a globalized world order, geopolitics still matters. And so I wanted to go back to those years.
Interesting. And before I take the discussion further, since a lot of the audience will not have read the book yet, give us a sense of how you drafted these choice paths and essentially your models where Nehru is is a peacemaker and Indira Gandhi is a security seeker. You've, in a sense, turned this idea of idealism versus realism, which you just spoke about. But the idea that Nehru was not actually constricted, and seen, and you've compared them through as diverse sort of examples as the first and second Vietnam crisis, the first and second Formosa crisis, the Formosa crisis, the Sikkim annexation. You know, a lot of very, very interesting bits of history which you never really connected into a real policy. You sort of just saw them as India's reaction to X, Y, and Z. So just give us a quick sense of how you built these choice paths, if you like.
So I used quite an intuitive proposition. It's not my framework, but the idea that a state can envisage a role for itself in the international system or in its neighborhood. The idea of a role conception, that is, a state can define certain goals, it can perform a certain function, and the term peacemakers actually goes back to Nehru's own guidance telegram. So this is in 1946-47, where he's sending out a telegram to his envoys in the United Nations. And he's practically laying out that we are the peacemakers. So, but I'm showing peacemaking in high politics. So I'm not saying that they're doing it in institutions or in sort of comfortable situations. If anything, they are playing active peacemaking when the height of the Cold War, as it is, you're talking of threats by the United States to use tactical nuclear weapons in crises. I mean, we haven't reached that stage yet, maybe in the Crimean crisis and a few others, but on the whole, you're dealing in situations where India is not doing costless peacemaking. So the critique to this argument is that Nehru didn't really believe in peacemaking. He was actually a Kautilyan, a Curzon, when it comes down to it. So the one way to challenge that argument is to see or test his behavior in situations that are truly important for Indian security, like the US-Pakistan alliance. Look at his reaction to that alliance. He accommodates that pact. I mean, if a political leader does it today, they'll be hounded out of office. What does he do? He says, we are not going to deal with this alliance by a counter-alliance or a defensive alignment with the Soviet Union. And let's not forget, the Soviets offered everything to India after that alliance with no strings attached. He spurns them. And he goes out and he's saying, we're going to deal with the security problem as part of a larger context of the Cold War, and we're going to contain this escalating tension. Now, it may sound irresponsible that how could you take this, why didn't you build up your military strength immediately? But he took a longer range view, and for the most part, he actually succeeds in keeping stability on India's frontiers right up till the China crisis, which is a completely different subject and deserves a major study in itself. So, I use the idea of a role and how the peacemaking role just completely falls apart after 62 and 65, where Indians are drawn inwards. Of course, there's economic crisis, political crisis, the single party system is kind of fragmenting. You've got neighborhood in crisis. You've got Pakistan truly now pumped up, and we've seen cases of the F-16 flying around. Their military strength by 1965 and certainly by the late 60s had reached a position where they could challenge Indian security. So we needed to respond to that. In some sense, you're seeing Indian adaptation to a changing balance of power. But yet there were always ideas still in the background that said, let's continue this peacemaking role. So I show that tension in the Vietnam War. And I think the Vietnam War, when Indira Gandhi comes in January 1966, is really sort of the final sort of, you could say, the end of the idea of peacemaking. In that sense.
Interesting, and we already know which side you seem to have ranged yourself on. Mr. Menon, if I could ask you firstly for your thoughts on the book, but also on this idea of this, not just peacemaker and security seeker, but the fact that idealism was actually not just idealism, there was realpolitik, and the realpolitik was even more real, if you like, and was much more tactical. In the time of Indira Gandhi, as some of these models seem to say?
Well, you know, for me, the best part of this book is that Nehru comes across not in this unifocal, unidimensional sort of idealist or realist, or that you actually get a sense of the complexity of how he and Indira Gandhi dealt with foreign policy problems and with real world crises. I mean, it's one, you know, people use all these phrases that Nehru was a realist in idealist clothing, or frankly, to me, the real amazing thing is that with very little power at his disposal, with very few capabilities actually, he was able to try and build an area of peace, as he called it, in Asia, to keep the Cold War, or at least the risk of conflict, away from India. And he was successful in this effort for a considerable period of time. And what actually destroyed the effort was not the US or the Soviet Union or the binary Cold War problem, but was ultimately China after 59. And so there's a third aspect, which I hope he writes the next book on China, the book that he alluded to, because it's amazing when you see with so little at his disposal how much the superpowers end up relying on Nehru, on Krishna Menon. When you look at the Geneva Conference, at Laos, at Vietnam, at the roles that India was playing at that stage in each of these crises after the Korean War. And that's the beauty of the book for me, that it actually conveys to you how much can be done with so little power. So it's not only about power, it's a form of political jujitsu, actually. You're using other people's weight and momentum to actually create outcomes which work for you. And that is, for me, that is the height of political skill. And it's something that we seem sometimes to have forgotten. We seem to think that everything is just straightforward power, and that it's just the balance of power that counts, and if we can't, it doesn't mean anything. And what proves that is really the negative case. When you look at, as he describes the Indira Gandhi period as a period of security seeking, look at the difference in India's role when the Vietnam War is on, when ASEAN is being formed in 67, you're not even invited to be part of it. And look at the difference between Bandung in 56 and 67. You can be a security seeker, look at the world from purely realist points of view and just say, I'll do a calculation, who's more powerful, and I will then balance, I will find my... But in the process, you impoverish yourself because you actually then bring the problem to your own borders. Throughout the 70s, late 60s, 70s, and even in the early 80s, your main preoccupations are within your own periphery, are dealing with threats right next to you, rather than dealing with the question of peace in Asia or of actually trying to enlarge the area of peace and diminish the chances of conflict. So for me, this is an object lesson in not just thinking of foreign policy and that the most selfish foreign policy is the one that actually takes other people's interests into account. It's an interesting, and so for me, the security seeker versus peacemaker, it's a no-brainer. To the extent that you can, to the extent that the situation permits, that other people's weight can be used by you to create peace, really that is a necessary function of the state and of Indian diplomacy. Because otherwise you actually impoverish yourself and you end up facing threats which are ultimately domestic, as former Vice President Ansari mentioned. Pretty soon, what ended up, by the 80s, you could no longer distinguish between external threats. You look at Sri Lanka, look at cross-border terrorism out of Pakistan, that distinction vanished. In fact, you were now preoccupied with things within your boundary, not just on your boundary. And it's that shrinking of the Indian world, of the Indian mind, of the Indian diplomatic mind, which for me was the most valuable lesson of the book. I mean, I'm not going into what Zorawar was saying because I actually agree with every word he said. I have one other point though. You know, when Mr. Narasimha Rao did this great revolution in Indian foreign policy in 91, apart from economic reforms and whatever, he always said, he claimed at least, that he was the true legatee of Jawaharlal Nehru. He said, I'm not changing anything. Now that's a bit of a fiction because, you know the changes, instances, I mean, Israel, Taiwan, you name it, all of them, including the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement with China, relationship with the US, et cetera, et cetera. But there is enough truth in it, so that when we draw this artificial distinction between policy after 91 or 98, whichever you want to draw, whichever date you choose, and what we did in the 50s and 60s, for me, the distinction is not so clear. It's not as though we suddenly became not even born again, but realists, and suddenly we discovered realpolitik and we learned, and now we have the power, and therefore, the world is going to respect us. If you look at the actual outcomes that we created, when did we create the outcomes that actually worked for India? When our power wasn't that great, but when we were clever enough to use the situation and to actually see how we could use diplomacy, use everything, including multilateral, bilateral, every which form. And so when you look at how Zorawar has gone through each of the crises and decision-making, for me, that's the fascinating part of the book. There's one other thing I want to mention. There's this image somehow of Indira Gandhi being decisive, clear, and Nehru being an intellectual, waffler, couldn't make. If you actually look at the dates in the crises, when decisions were taken, it's actually the other way around. Nehru was very quick to react and to decide. Mrs. Gandhi would ask 1,000 people their opinion, wouldn't reveal her mind. Finally, she'd come to a decision. But once she came to a decision, she wouldn't change her mind. She was absolutely firm. I mean, you look at Sikkim, for instance. She took a long, long time, talked to all kinds of people, let all kinds of policies run at the same time. Whereas with Nehru, it wasn't that. He was willing to review later. He was willing to actually say, wasn't I silly? I made a mistake. And part of the problem is because he did that, his critics today are ready to use his own words against him all the time. And you look at the record, it's amazing when you think of a head of government who is so honest about his own mistakes in public and analyzes his own work and looks at it. It's a remarkable quality, actually. But for me, therefore, to your question about realism, and I don't see such a clear distinction. I see rather this constant attempt to create outcomes which work for India's interests, and the consciousness that this we cannot do alone. And therefore, you need to use every diplomatic means available to you to achieve this.
All right. Interesting. And, this constant word national interests is particularly interesting when you look at the book, because you see that actually it's no longer about what is in India's national interest just in terms of what's inside India's boundaries and what challenges us in our immediate neighborhood. It's much more about the fact that other people's interests are also our interests. So I do want to come to you, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, and ask you, so there is this template set, if you like, with Vietnam first crisis versus Vietnam second crisis, and the fact that Nehru was almost, sitting at the table and passing messages between various leaderships on what could possibly happen. And you contrast that, as Ambassador Menon said, a kind of shrinking of ambition with, say, what we did to the east of us in Myanmar a few years ago when there was this full-blown crisis. But we said, we shouldn't get involved. We shouldn't say anything. How do you think that evolution came? Because clearly in the early parts, certainly in the 1950s, it seemed as if India wasn't just being a peacemaker, it was sort of bringing, it's sort of a rule maker almost when it came to resolving these crises.
Yeah. Well, I think that question is really mostly answered in Zorawar's book. And it's really answered by the two developments in the 60s, the 1962 war and 1965. And in fact, there's a very interesting passage where he quotes Indira Gandhi, actually directly critiquing Nehru's neighborhood policy and saying that, this whole idea that you can give concessions, that concessions would make good neighbors, is in fact disproved by his own, so to say, neighborhood policy. And then actually she defines something very interesting, that, that national interests are defined by self-interests, but applied in a fair manner. And it's not ever either or. Even as she is trying to assert the kind of primacy of India's national interest in the subcontinent, she's saying that there is a space for a fair interest. So I think that is a very interesting thing. And the second thing that, in a way is an amplification of what Ambassador Menon just said, is that there's something really very interesting in Zorawar's account of the development of Prime Minister Nehru's so to say, political vision and philosophy, because in a way he actually goes back to history, 20th century history, European history in particular, the two world wars, and articulates a kind of really a world view in which, which actually sets the template, so that when something like the 1954 alliance with the Pakistan-US alliance takes place, he is able to, get away from the immediate the neighborhood, immediate locality, something that has actually weighed down our foreign policy for several years. This whole issue that, do we let Pakistan pull us down, or do we transcend Pakistan and play a much larger role in the world? And I think Nehru was able to use his vision and his historical sort of background to translate, maybe it didn't work, but this whole idea of an area of peace, this whole idea that your security can be dealt with or needed to be dealt with at any place in Asia, wherever there was a Cold War shadow that is to fall. And this whole idea that I think, again, Zorawar underlines a lot, which is the indivisibility of security, that Asian security, subcontinental security, and Indian security were all linked. And the shrinking, precisely what you came to, that started in a way with Indira Gandhi, that in a way the focus shifted away from Asia. In a way, even the effort, of course, a much more difficult effort in the second Indochina crisis, was given up at some point as futile, but also because of a lack of interest, also because of a prioritization that really our interests are in the subcontinent. And again, I think, by actually reducing ourselves in the subcontinent, we brought our conflicts much closer to ourselves, and in a way, as Ambassador Menon says, also within our own map.
Interesting. Would you agree with that? That actually, when we had a much easier, softer policy, in fact, in the first East Pakistan crises, as Zorawar's book puts out, Nehru's actually given many very interventionary options, and he kind of just walks away, dismisses them out of hand. But would you agree that Zorawar has a line at the end of his book in his conclusions where he says that in fact, India towered over other southern Asia in every metric of capabilities in the 1950s. And somehow, as the decades went by, India now seems, surrounded by this ring of fire that engulfs it at any minute, and that ring of fire are essentially India's neighbors.
I don't want to start a war between Zorawar and Srinath Raghavan, but if you look at Srinath's account, he tells you how during several crises, the various East Pakistan crises, 50, 51, when waves of refugees came across, Nehru actually used coercion, including military mobilization and the threat of force, to actually get Pakistan to the table and to deal with the issue. And that's how you ended up with the Nehru-Liaquat Pact and so on, when Pakistan was most unwilling to get into this. And so this myth that somehow, that I know Indira Gandhi says, and it is quoted in the book as saying that, he made concessions to the neighbors. But I don't think if you look at his Pakistan policy in detail in the first few years, and this is precisely the Pakistani argument, that because of that coercion, they went and did 54 with the US. Or November 53, the agreement to buy weapons, the agreement from the US to sell weapons to them. So I think it's a little more complicated than, he was quite willing to use, to threaten, when states integration was going on, to threaten that he'd use the army in order to encourage people to sign the standstill agreements and the accession instruments of accession. So it's not quite that he ran a soft policy towards Pakistan through the early crises. And in a sense, his policy worked. Pakistan, decided to try to use force and to take J&K from you when Nehru was gone, when they saw weakness and they thought that after trying you out in the Run of Kutch, that they had an opportunity. And that's when you got Gibraltar 65 and so on.
All of that. So if I can put that question to you, because your book is called Choices. And I remember in the chapter that you wrote about 26/11 and the Mumbai attacks, you said those were the choices we made at that time. A different government at a different time would have made a different choice.
Well, even the same government at a different time
would have made a different choice. Given all that's happened in the last couple of months here, the idea that India has now crossed a new red line in terms of sending planes to bomb areas that are no longer even part of disputed territory, but in Pakistan itself, how would you see the earlier government of the 1950s, of Nehru, having dealt with today's kind of issues? Because obviously he didn't have to deal with the same kind of
Yeah, the same kinds of threats. So, I don't know what they'd have done in the 50s if they had faced this kind of threat, because their capacities were much more limited and they had much fewer options. I mean, why did we go to the Security Council? Why did we go to the UN? Why did we accept the ceasefire? Because the army told us they couldn't sustain what they were doing. And, there was no way that we had the capabilities that we have today to do these things. Today, I think it's a different issue. Today's Pakistan is not the Pakistan of the 50s. There are structural problems in Pakistan which lead me to expect, at least, that cross-border terrorism is not going to stop. There is enough, whether it's the Pakistan Army, the ISI, or the jihadi tanzeems and so on. They now have an existence of their own. They have a critical mass of their own, which actually sustains this. So, yes, you can use force in order to try and restore deterrence. But whether you're successful or not, you can't measure day to day. This is not a T20 match where, every ball is a 6 or a wicket, or where you have an immediate result at the end of every day. This is a much slower process. As I say, actually, in Choice, the Israelis have a good phrase for this, that it's mowing the grass. You have to keep going back in and mowing the grass. You never solve the problem. The grass will keep growing, but you don't let it grow to the stage where you get trapped in the undergrowth and you can't walk. And so that's the process we're stuck in dealing with the kinds of threats we face today. They were lucky in the 50s they didn't face it, but Pakistan tried. What were raiders in Kashmir? What was 48? They tried exactly the same. And there's been a thread of this kind of asymmetric use of non-state actors, whether you call them tribal raiders in 48, whether you call them infiltrators in 65. But they've done it to compensate for their conventional inferiority as they saw it. When they thought they might have parity or even, some limited superiority in armor and so on, in 65, they actually went to war.
All right. Zorawar, so we've done the region and certainly a little bit to the east. You come to the relationship with the big powers, US, USSR, and then Russia, and then China. The truth is that today we talk about a multi-alignment. You've actually quoted Krishna Menon saying exactly why non-alignment was necessary at the time. And you make it seem as if for Nehru, the Soviet Union was almost a distasteful option. But that doesn't really bear out with a lot of other writings that we see from Nehru.
Yeah, so, no, but, so I think there's this impression that Nehru was very eager for a strategic partnership with the Soviet Union. I don't think that's true at all. So, and I don't shy away from this. I actually show that for the period from 1950, which I've covered, to 55, maybe up till the Suez Crisis, which I've actually done separately as a journal article, this period of 6 years, India's foreign policy had a lot of coordination happening with London, let's face it, in how the Cold War was being managed, particularly in Asia. Don't forget that the British were the only other Western link to the Chinese regime. And I think, and this actually comes to that point of how you're managing this great power triangle. You've heard of that Roosevelt's idea of 4 policemen, United States, the Russians, even the Chinese were, of course, one of those. So the Anglo-American grand strategy was always aimed at splitting up the Russians and the Chinese from the very start. Even hardliners like Dulles, Eisenhower, the way they chose to do it was a little different than from the British. The British and the Indians, and Nehru, of course, had his own view that we are going to engage the Chinese, bring them into the Asian system. The Americans took a line that we're going to pressurize the Chinese, that until their link with the Soviets is in a certain fashion, they're not going to gain the benefits of being a part of the international community. So I think where now, maybe a little reflect, I just wanted this because this has a contemporary point that, and this comes out in that crisis in 1955 when the Indians are trying to bring the Americans and the Chinese closer, and this is extraordinary what they're doing. I mean, Nehru's confidant, Krishna Menon, spends 10 days in Beijing talking to Zhou Enlai and the Chinese are crafting their positions based on what India is saying. They are actually, their history and their politics doesn't allow them to accept the role that India plays. So you see some of the archival, declassified material, their portrayal of history. India has been put aside, similarly to how the Americans look at that. But, when it comes, so I'm just coming to this point where the Americans, despite all the bluster, nuclear threats, they actually wanted that opening with the Chinese. They wanted a link at that point. So there's this quote where I think Nehru writes to Krishna Menon when suddenly this crisis ends and the Americans and the Chinese agree to ambassadorial talks in Warsaw, and the United States makes a significant decision to refer to the communist regime as the People's Republic of China. So this is pretty significant based on what's happening. They've just fought a war where tens of thousands have been killed on either side. So Nehru replies to Krishna Menon, I hope this does not leave the impression to the British and the Americans that we are a bigger advocate of the Chinese position than they are themselves. So they could not, so we never really understood this grand strategy, and it comes down to the 60s. In 1966, at the heart of the Vietnam War, you have Lyndon Johnson, who makes a public statement, literally leaving the olive branch to the Chinese, where he makes a statement, the future Asia will have China inside that system. And at the same time, you're having border skirmishes with the Indians and the Chinese. And so look at Indira Gandhi's statement. She goes to Moscow and makes a statement pretty much talking about Chinese revisionism. And 48 hours, you have Lyndon Johnson reading out to the Chinese. Of course, we know in 71, this kind of cracks up open. So the idea that in 71, we just suddenly discovered, this was actually, we were ready for it in a sense. You know, it's like you have to just click. So it comes down to today. When you're looking at the Americans and the Chinese fighting and contesting, never forget that the American strategic mind, the Anglo-American mind, does not want a confrontation and a Cold War with China the way it waged with the Russians. You have that Mackinder view that the inner heartland is where we're going to contain it. The rimland regions need to be brought in. So it'll take a lot more for confrontation to happen. So we have to, as contemporary Indian policymakers, strategists, be ready for the prospect that you can have stable Sino-American relations and competition. So how are you crafting your balance of power strategy needs to be a little more sophisticated than saying that, hey, now is the time to team up with these guys because aren't they about to wage another? No, they're not. They want you into their camp for other reasons, not to contain China. So, but maybe that's a good, but I think we need to be really cautious of that because and history tells us that they are simply not at this stage ready for that kind of, because they will lose Asia if they go to that.
Okay, and certainly there is a reach out from Stalin even in the 1950, which
while Mao Zedong is in Moscow negotiating the treaty.
That's right. Ambassador Menon, if you'd want to
fighting in Telangana. We're fighting.
Yes. We were. If you'd like to touch a bit on that, both with Russia. As well as, I mean, we're either very blessed or not so blessed to be living in a time when suddenly all of this history is now being discussed so closely. You know, when the Pulwama attack happened, I remember within a little while, the Twitter conversation had moved very quickly from this has been done by Pakistan to this has been done, by Masood Azhar. Masood Azhar is someone that China has been protecting. And then within, I think, 2 days, even, the top sort of leadership was talking about how blame Nehru because he refused the UNSC seat, which has allowed China the veto that now confronts us. And Zorawar does deal a little bit with this. Would you like to try and put some of these demons to rest?
Well, I can't put these demons to rest because, these are man-made demons which obviously have an immediate political purpose. Nobody's trying to tell you real history or actually find out what really happened. These are, and so therefore they have to be dealt with accordingly, what they are, which is somebody floats these fake little stories and tries to influence your thinking. And you just need to be mentally strong enough to see through this nonsense. But the fact is that what Zorawar says is absolutely right. If you look at the lessons that you can draw from the crises that we saw earlier, and especially 71, the Sino-US alliance, basically, a de facto alliance that you then faced and dealt with, and how Mrs. Gandhi knew that this was coming for years before that. and tried various things, including reaching out to China directly before that, which is why I think you should do the China book. But today,
We're hoping you'll also do one.
let's see, we'll.
Yeah, I'm open for that.
No, today, if you well, whatever their differences with each other and the levels of contention in their relationship between China and the US might have gone up tremendously, but they have a common interest in limiting India's rise. After all, nobody wants the rise of peer competitors in the world. I mean, it's a stated goal of US policy since World War II, and to prevent the rise of a peer competitor in the globe. It used to be the Soviet Union. Much of what you see today is to prevent China from reaching that level. Whether she will or not is another issue altogether. That's a matter of judgment. So given that, I think you need to be aware, therefore, that your interests are best served by you yourself. Nobody else shares your interests in today's. You cannot rely on Sino-US contention to get your work done in the world and to create a world where your interests will be served. And what Zorawa says is absolutely right. I think in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we were very aware of this, of the play that was available in the international system. Somehow, I'm not sure that we are as conscious of how much play there is in the system. We seem to take a much more black and white. Part of it is because of Twitter, is because of television, because our attention spans are limited, and because we now treat it as black and white, true or false, good or bad. Which is it's not true. I mean,
Friend and foe.
Friend and foe, exactly. Cross the Rubicon, all these wonderful phrases, though things are. This is politics. Politics is a process. It's not an engineering problem that you solve. And so I think somehow there is some misunderstanding here. So I actually agree with Zorawa that really, for me, is a lesson we need to draw from what he's written in the book. My big worry, though, is that nobody 30 years from now will be able to write the same kind of history about Pulwama, about what we've gone through in the last few years, as Zorawa has written here. For three reasons. One is, I hate to say this, the RTI Act. Nobody writes the truth in government anymore because they're very conscious that their notes will become public. Secondly, the level of probity actually has gone down, whether we like it or not. I mean, let's be frank. So, honest argument, which used to be our bread and butter, at least in MEA. I remember the day we joined, we were told we're a service of peers. You have the right to express your opinion no matter who you are. And I've done it. As Undersecretary, I've argued on file with the Foreign Secretary and got a hearing. And that I don't think exists anymore, that culture of honest argument, saying, okay, we'll argue it out on file, we'll write it out, you'll see, and let logic prevail. That, I think, those days are gone. But most important, I think, is because we are so concentrated on the projection, on the image, that we've forgotten that we're dealing with real issues and real people. So when I look at the quality of the writing that he's been reading, that he actually brings out here, I don't think 30 years from now, if any of us decides to write a history, we'll ever be able to do it. And for me, that is really a sad thought. I mean, it really makes me depressed.
And also, what the former Vice President referred to as the prominence of domestic policy in every foreign policy decision. Do you want to weigh in a little bit on that, on the idea today that no foreign policy, I mean, I'm sure no foreign policy decision was ever taken without some domestic policy contending there, but the balance of power in that decision-making is now purely domestic.
Yeah, I think, this was actually particularly manifest in the first East Bengal, so to say, crisis, the Hindu refugees who came across, and the intense sort of debate and actually contest, tussle for decision-making between Patel and Nehru on that. And again, very interesting how Nehru was able to, in a way, finesse that by actually using international mediation, both the US and the UK. No, undoubtedly, I think what you say is absolutely true. Today, the room for maneuver is much less, but I would also say, in a way, it is a choice that has been made by our leaders right now. It's not something that has been imposed on us. And, look, you have dominant leaders at all stages. I mean, Nehru was a very dominant leader. Indira Gandhi became a very dominant leader. Even as a dominant leader, he faced, scrutiny from people like Patel and many others. And today you have a situation, we also have dominant leaders, but actually you prefer to go along with the crowd rather than actually lead in some way.
Interesting. I do want to come to audience questions in a bit, but can we do a sort of quick round on Zoravar's big idea on non-alignment? That actually the non-alignment that we saw in the 1950s was an empowering thing. It was something that allowed India to actually involve itself in the affairs of the world. And then since then, there's been a kind of attrition, and everything's been a kind of approximation of non-alignment. Over maybe a few decades, it became the excuse. We can't do this because we are non-aligned. In the last few years, of course, it's become an object of revulsion. It's the chains that shackle us, and therefore. But the idea which struck me was that while we think that it is only this government that walked out of non-alignment in a sense, didn't go to the actual, in fact, you were at the last non-aligned summit, but the Prime Minister didn't go, no member of the cabinet went either, and now we don't refer to non-alignment. I think the last foreign policy statement I saw was perhaps the Foreign Secretary who said, we are aligned, and we are aligned on every issue, but it's not with the same person on every issue. So the new catchphrase, if you like, in FP is called 50-50-50, which is 50 countries, different countries that are in the play in the international sphere will align with each other on 50 different forums on 50 different issues. So that's, just how the future is looked at. But how should we start with you? And if you could, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, tell us how you see non-alignment, especially in terms of Zoravar's book, and how you see its future, if at all.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that perhaps has been missed out in the discussion was Zoravar talks about certain partnerships. The partnership between Nehru and Menon, and also the partnership between Indira Gandhi and P.N. Huxer in the formulation of policy. I think that's, and in a way, the kind of Nehru-Menon partnership for peace is something that, in fact, if you look through history, has been practically unparalleled at any other stage and in any sustained way. I mean, the nearest that I can think of is Gorbachev with Shevardnadze. There was a purple period when they were coming out with these visionary ideas, but how long did it last? It simply did not last. So now it's a fact that, in a way it was so visionary that it sort of, and in fact, as Ambassador Menon said, it fell not because of the great power play, or our ability to play great powers, but because of a third factor, which was China. And again, I think Ambassador Menon pointed out that even in that sort of big power politics, there were different ways in which the game could be played. So you had Nehru playing it in the kind of peace, area of peace method, and you had Indira Gandhi playing in classical sort of balance of power method. Now, coming today, I think the fact is that to be able to play that kind of non-aligned role, you also have to have those templates and those visions that allowed you to actually plow a consistent path, regardless of the challenges, the expedient sort of contingent challenges that came on your way. Now, I don't see that kind of, foreign policy vision, which would allow, there is something in common. I mean, the fact is that if there is one common element in our foreign policy right through is in one way or the other, we've tried to preserve our so-called strategic autonomy, whether it's by 50-50-50 or it's by non-alignment or anything that came in between. So I think it's very, very difficult. But I think if there is one area where we could do it, and there's one kind of entire axis of foreign policy that somehow we have not explored as a country, it is what we could call, utilizing our economic potential and economic power in a kind of geo-economic diplomacy. I think we've concentrated far too much for too long on Paul Mill and kind of security-oriented diplomacy, and we've neglected the possibility of the kind of, I'm not comparing it with China, BRI, but the fact is that the whole world has moved on to a period of, into a phase of, global investments. We are still stuck in a kind of, make in India mode, which is in a way a kind of just a continuation of Swadeshi and self-reliance. This whole idea that you can go global, that you can use comparative advantages, that you can use value chains, regional and international value chains, that your investments abroad, both in sort of large investments as well as smaller investments, can be actually an instrument of strength in your international diplomacy. I mean, Japan has done it, Germany has done it, the United States, of course, started it all after the war. Now you find, China is doing it. Countries like Thailand and others are doing it, but we have not yet come to that. And I think this is an area that, it sidesteps the whole issue of alignment or non-alignment. And it actually talks about your economic strength and the external projection and how you convert that into a kind of diplomatic, tool.
All right, Ambassador Menon, because there was a period even when you were NSA when it was non-alignment versus the US. It was, those were the two sort of choices for India.
No, but I think, when you say, non-alignment lost effectiveness and then became defensive and became reactive and became actually an excuse not to do things. I think the problem with, we've been non-aligned or strategically autonomous consistently, but the situation around us has changed. Until 56, let's say until 59, say, you were dealing with a primarily bipolar world, and in that situation, non-alignment actually gave you many more options and allowed you to do many other things. But that changed thereafter. And you could see the change in the 70s when the big issues are Afghanistan, Kampuchea, Vietnam, where, frankly, you're no longer a major participant at all. So when the international situation changes, the value of that policy also and its applicability and the fruits it gives you change. You then ended up in post-Cold War unipolar moment. And it was really a moment, but it was the 2 decades of globalization, which you really benefited from. And being non-aligned actually worked for you because you could then work with, you had a multivalent policy, as it were. You worked with everybody. And it worked very well for you. But since 2008, since the economic crisis, you're actually in the great disorder. And you're between orders. You don't know what the order is. Nobody has a proper description of what it is. And so now the problem is you can keep doing the same thing, but you can't expect the same result if the situation in which you're doing it is different. That's another variation of Einstein's definition of madness, right? Of doing the same thing and expecting a different result. In this case, you're in a different situation, you're doing the same thing and expecting the same result. So, and what is good in Zorawar book actually is he shows that when he speaks of 4 kinds of non-alignment and it's different policies. That's why the plural of Indian foreign policies, because its application is different. So you start doing it in different ways. But that core of strategic autonomy, of relying on yourself and ultimately increasing your agency in the system and your capability, I think that is there. Whether you do internal balancing and strengthening yourself, external balancing, working with other powers, as you have been doing, whether it's with Japan, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, Singapore, whatever, because suddenly your main preoccupation is China. So, but whichever way you choose to do it, you're still non-aligned. So I think, frankly, we put too much meaning and we poor non-alignment. As a term, it carries so much baggage with it. And it's as though, and certainly among American scholars, it's like they're allergic to this. That you just have to use the word and they hit the roof. It's quite sad, actually. So it's a very easy way to get them to jump if you want.
Sort of. I'll come to Zorawar and then I'm going to come to some questions. Zorawar, do you want to just weigh in very quickly on this idea of non-alignment? Because you've actually given a new sort of definition, if you like. So it's not non-alignment. I know your time they worked on non-alignment 2.0, but it's actually, today you would have to find a non-alignment 5.0.
So one definition of non-alignment that I like is, which was there from the start, and I think it should still be maybe more relevant now, is we're not going to partake in your conflicts, in a sense. So that's a nice way of putting non-alignment. Of course, one is the core, that we are an independent power with a manifest destiny that we're going to be a great power. So a great power by definition cannot be a part of another alliance. It's going to build its own alliances at some stage. But this idea that we are not going to partake in your conflicts is relevant because we might just be being pulled into areas where it is actually not your fight. You don't have anything really to play in the Western Pacific. Why should you be trying to aggregate the maritime balance of power even further with the US alliance system, which frankly today dominates the scene there? So what are you trying to do? Unless you're trying to get some leverage with the Chinese, but then their reaction on your periphery opens up. So I don't know if you ever think through those parts. So I would say, for me, that definition, but being non-aligned and independent gives you enormous amount of flexibility. So it's a false caricature to say that you are somehow constrained by being non-aligned. You can't play unshaped world order questions, or you can't partake in. So even Nehru had this point that we will sacrifice our sovereignty if it comes to genuine multilateral cooperation on an equal playing field. We're ready to do that today. The moment we are talking of hierarchical structures or being a part of some sort of a single block where you're going to be listening, and it's not a two-way interlocution, then that's not going to work. So it allows you to engage with security problem, non-traditional security, maritime security. You can do the whole works while being non-aligned. But there are limits to how far you can go. And if you recognize those, then you start crafting more sophisticated policies in a range of spectrum. So, which gives you a lot of flexibility.
Interesting. How would you then place the US's South Asia policy and India's supposed role in Afghanistan in that kind of framework?
Yeah, so in fact, that whole Afghan conflict from 79, in some sense, you've always been riding off the back of whoever's there and hoping that that will solve your security problems on your Western neighborhood. And what is our premise been or hope or vision that at some point that will alter the dynamics within Pakistan? But if anything, it's done the worst. The first one actually created almost an irregular force. No, the Pakistan army stayed as it did. It got even stronger. But it created another force. And look what happened after 2001. The Pakistani military today can stand up to you in a conventional fight because of the military aid that it's received in the last 20 years from the Americans and then, of course, the Chinese. So what have you got? And you were cheerleading this conflict after 2001, thinking that finally terrorism and finally you're going to change the balance of power in South Asia. I don't think the balance of power in South Asia has improved in your favor because of this conflict. Maybe because you've grown stronger in other matters, but you've actually opened yourself up to an adversary on the other side who you're ignoring because it may not suit you and in sort of being this bigger player, but you have to actually deal with conventional power today and nuclear power that can pretty much match everything that India throws in the field. So we're not ready for this. So,
all right. I think you've provoked enough news discussions that can be held, and hopefully got everyone to go and read your book as well. Could I just see with a show of hands if people have questions, and then and then I'll try to come to each one of you. Would the young gentleman in the front like to start, and then we'll.
Well, thank you everyone for the. Well, I teach international relation and 12th class students I teach. So thank you so much. I have benefited. I cannot tell you how much. So thank you so much to each and every one of you. So the moment the question is rather directly to Ambassador Gautam. So you were talking about that we have not used this leverage of it, kind of like a growing economic power. I would like to come to the gruesome killing of Jamal Khashoggi. So what the Saudi Arabia did, we know more or less they did. They tried to deny whatever, kept fabricating stories. Do you think when we deal with these rogues, not rogues here, but kingdom, how do we deal with Middle East when they are getting away with things like that? And the Trump says, hey, you know what, I've got $1 billion deal, I'm going to do anything about it. How do you think India should react to it, given the fact that we have one of the largest Muslim population in our country? How it's going to work out? So sure. That was the question.
Do you want to take that, including the last bit which baffled me?
Well, honestly, I'm a little at odds. I don't see any direct connection. I think, we are pursuing our interests with Saudi Arabia. and that has its own place. We have to balance other relationships as well in this, and somehow I think we have to manage, and and we have a. So I think we have to manage. I mean, look, there will always be rogue actions, and there is no country that is exempt from rogue actions. If we look at rogue actions of X, Y country, I think we can all make a catalogue of, extremely difficult, challenges like that. I think it's not that we have to overlook, but I mean, these are things that you have to deal with, issue by issue.
All right. Gentleman, yeah, right there.
Thank you, ma'am. मेरा नाम G.K. Sharma है. I am a professor, and geo-economic and political studies have always been my area. Compliments to Mr. Zorawar for writing a beautiful book. And my question is addressed to Menon Sahab or Gautam ji, or even Honorable Vice President of India, former Vice President, can answer if he feels like. You see, this book has been written on India's foreign policy during Cold War. And I would like to bring this discourse slightly to the current situation. I would like to ask whoever wants to reply, is our current foreign policy is an extension of the India's foreign policies during the Cold War, or it is completely disconnect from that, and now we are having an entirely new foreign policy?
All right. Could we take a few more questions? We've got yours. There's one lady right at the back and one gentleman in the middle. You can stay.
Hi, my name is Khimta. I'm from the Quint. You all talked about the diplomatic mind.
Mic to your mouth.
Sorry?
Put the mic closer.
Sorry. You all talked about the diplomatic mind. So if you look at India's diplomatic mind today, how would you characterize it? Would you say it's embarrassingly shrunken or sufficiently enlarged? How would you characterize it?
All right. There's one gentleman in the middle also. We'll come in the next round to your side.
Yeah, this is Gopalan, former secretary. Wanting to know the application of soft power in international relations during the non-alignment time and at this point in time, how different it is and how effective it is.
All right. And one last one here, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, ma'am. My question is mainly on the Cold War era. I'm not going beyond that. A lot has been said, and repeatedly Shri Nehru and Madam Gandhi has been mentioned. But we've been lucky to have two Chanakyas during this era. There's been passing reference to them, but I would love to mention them. And these two Chanakyas, if they had not been there, the situation would be altogether different.
No, the whole book is just about them.
Right.
So the question, sir.
I have five factors to mention. Those should be taken into account. Shri V.K. Krishna Menon, Shri P.N. Aksar, sabotage of USSR and rise of China, Commonwealth and the people of Indian origin.
But is
and
there a question?
All our oil dependency on the Middle East. These are the factors that are contributing to foreign policy. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Do you want to quickly take some of the questions that have been asked? Then I want to go to this side.
Well, completely distinct foreign policy. I don't think we are a different country. We have the same people. So I don't think that it would be a completely distinct foreign policy. But clearly there are nuances, there are differences, and I think that has been, I'm sure you yourself know quite a lot about that. Certainly one thing is very strong, that there is a lot more show and there's a lot more transactional element in our current foreign policy. I mean, I think certain values and certain, call it principles if you like, but I think values is a better word here. To some extent, that sort of thing is not very visible now. The most pronounced feature that I can think of is the leverage of two things. One is, of course, the diaspora in as many ways as possible. And the second is, I think, this whole idea that, we can jump to the fourth revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, and leverage technology in ways that we could not do earlier. Now, I don't think on the latter point, there would be, on either of these 2 points, there would be a big difference or big discontinuity between the past. I think it's more evolutionary than anything else. But ultimately, it's the question of the uses that you make of your strength that I think I would like to, I mean, I don't have any answer, I cannot respond to that, but I think it's something that I think we all need to think about. What are the uses that we wish to make of this, so to say, new sense of power? The second is diplomatic mind. Whether there is any great, what is the content of the diplomatic mind? I see former Foreign Secretary Salman Haider is here. And once I had a discussion with him and I asked him, where exactly is the mind of our, diplomacy? This was when he was Foreign Secretary. And I think he was as nonplussed by that question as I was myself. It's often been very difficult to find exactly what is the core, what is that single sort of driving instrument in our foreign policy. And I think, India is a big country, complex country, different regions, different, impulses. And we don't have the luxury of many of the more monolithic or, so to say, single nation countries to be able to have a very clear foreign policy. And I think the good foreign policy is one that is able to manage and accommodate all the sort of various impulses that we have. Now, that itself is a subject of a long discussion, so I won't go into it. Soft power in international relations. I think this is a very interesting question. I think we talk about soft power, and very often when we think of soft power, we think of culture, maybe development assistance, our development partnership, and so on. But I think another thing that we need to think about is the role of soft politics, friendly politics. Now, this, of course, impinges on this whole question of relationship with neighbors. And again, there is no single clear answer to this. But one thing is worth thinking. Why is it that let's say if we had to think of all our neighbors in our immediate neighborhood, who would you consider the closest and best friend of India at this point of time? Would it be Afghanistan or, let's say, Nepal? Despite the kind of, or Bangladesh, despite the kind of, the different elements that come into that picture. And if that is so, why? Of course, there's the fact that we may not have a physical, an immediate border that can make a big difference. But I think it's also politics, and I think it's also diplomacy. And one of that aspects is that soft power should also have a place for soft politics. By soft politics, of course, I mean friendly politics, the ability to win friends through good politics. Now, this dangerously sort of impinges on this whole issue of concessions and so on, and the Gujarat doctrine, and various other things, asymmetric relationships and so on. But again, I just leave that thought with you. Why is it that our relationship with Afghanistan is so good and our relationship with Nepal is so complicated, beyond the issue of just the fact that there are border issues between us? I think that generally takes care of all the questions.
Well, I think because we have a border with Nepal which is completely open, I think that's part of the problem. It's so intimate. These are really problems of intimacy. And if you look at all our borders in South Asia, there's cross-border ethnicities, same language, same religion. These are artificial borders, let's face it. The only geographical border you have with a neighbor is with China, the Himalayas, and the sea, the ocean with Sri Lanka. But the rest of them, it's the same people on both sides. Chin here, Mizos here, Chin on the other side. It's Nagas on both sides, wherever you look. And I think the problem is these are new nation states. It's not only partition created the Republic of India and, Pakistan, but these are also, and how do you assert nationhood? Except vis-a-vis the dominant and this predominant heavy, this weight which is next to you. I keep saying, we Indians, when we meet Nepalese, we say, "Arey, aap to bilkul hamare jaise hain." And we mean it well, we mean it in a friendly way. To him, you've threatened his identity. You've just threatened to swallow him up without even thinking about it. And I think there is a real problem here. So when he talks of soft politics, for me, that's where you need to start, at least in the neighborhood. But to go back to the question, is our foreign policy new or is it an extension? Luckily, most of it is an extension. And therefore, it's still India's foreign policy. The trouble is we're a democracy. So every government would tell you, my predecessors, absolute idiots. They didn't know what they were doing. I'm doing new, wonderful things. Only me. The world has just started with me. And this is normal in democratic politics. You're trying to distinguish yourself. But I don't think anybody believes it. And luckily, the rest of the world sees the continuity. Where you have changed is where actually you have also ended up in trouble, but you've also then tried to readjust. One is the use of foreign policy for domestic political gain. That, I think, has reached a level which we've never known before in the last 70 years. But I think that has diminishing returns. And ultimately, I have faith that the Indian people know when they see it happening. But the others, I think, there was, at one stage, we seemed to be buying into this Indo-Pacific strategy and to becoming much closer and tied strategically to the United States. But I think if you look at what Prime Minister Modi said in Shangri-La last year in Singapore, we redefined Indo-Pacific. We did what Shankara did to Hinduism. We redefined the Indo-Pacific in a way that made it quite different, obviously very different from what the US talks of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Because frankly, that's a strategy which is a maritime strategy, and we are both a continental and a maritime power. We have problems on land, which that is not going to address at all. So for me, luckily, the main lines of policy are basically the same. Where we've deviated, we've ended up in trouble. I hope we've learned lessons and that we will do better in the future. The Indian diplomatic mind today, it's... As Gautam said rightly, there's no one single mother brain sitting somewhere in South Block which, figures everything out and organizes it. And even in Nehru's time, this is a myth, that everything was Nehru's fault, or that everything was somehow sprang fully formed out of Nehru's brain. When you look at the documentation, at the files, for instance, there's a huge amount of discussion going on. It's not that they always agreed, that Indira Gandhi always accepted what P.N. Huxley said, or that there was no arguing with Nehru at all. So when we say the mind, what we mean is the end result of a fairly complicated process of argument within the system. And it's the quality of that argument that is important, that you need to be honest, you need to be able to look at things with an open mind and unless that's encouraged from the top, how do I put this? A leader, if you're any good, you want bad news. There are enough people in Delhi to tell you what they think you want to hear. What you need is, if you're a leader and you want to stay in touch, and these people will all push you out of touch with reality and push you up and away, far away. And it happens to every leader. You've seen it. Delhi knows this phenomenon. But that has to be encouraged from the top. You have to consciously break that and say, tell me the bad news. Okay, don't say it in public, don't say, this idiot leadership, but at least they need to generate some. That has shrunk over time. That ability in the system to cope with diversity, with different views, to stay in touch with reality, that has actually shrunk. That is so when we say the mind has shrunk, that's really what I mean. Not that here's mother brain and that is somehow unless cerebrum has shrunk or something. Soft power and NAM, I think let other people speak about it. I'm not very impressed by soft power. For me, ultimately, as Rava says, you need to look at the basic geopolitics. And you start with a balance of power and the situation, and the correlation of forces, as the communists used to say, because that is what really gives you the ability to work. But anyway, I'll leave that to Zoravar.
Okay, we do have time for one last question. I promised one gentleman right at the back there.
Thanks a lot. My name is Simon. I'm a French diplomat. And the panelists spoke of the concept of strategic autonomy. And it's a concept that echoes a lot with the strategic culture of my own country, France, which has been building its own strategic autonomy since, say, the 1960s. So I would be very grateful if the panelists could elaborate a little bit on this concept in terms of its history and concrete policy implications in the Indian context. Thanks a lot.
India's strategic
Do you want to take that very quickly?
Mr.
The strategic autonomy.
No, strategic deterrent.
Deterrent.
He says that that's what France has been building.
Okay.
And that India also seems to follow very similar policy. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I don't.
No,
Go ahead, go ahead.
you just I didn't get the question completely. So just yeah.
Just elaborate on the concept of strategic autonomy for the Indian decision makers. What does it concretely mean?
What does it mean in practice, you mean? Okay.
Yeah.
I think we discussed this, yeah. So the idea that that you are going to craft decisions based not on a particular coalition's definition of a security problem. So that's, I would say, that's what the military strategic dimension of strategic autonomy, which of course came into being was during the nuclear deal, where we protected your strategic deterrent. Of course, if you don't have that, then how can you have strategic autonomy? So to back up strategic autonomy, you do need to have the ability to defend the independent decisions you're making, because if a state can't do that, he's going to be coerced, which is what happens, right, with a client state or a middle power. So for until I would say the 1960s, you were relying on the balance of power because to protect you. And in fact, Nehru goes back even in the 1930s and before. He writes that they're making the case for an independent India. He's saying, how will India survive? Because the British argument, you guys cannot survive independently. So he said, we're going to survive because the great powers out there will have a vested interest in an independent India. To some extent, that's true, right? That even till this day, through the Cold War, one of these actors had some interest in keeping you as some sort of a balancer. Now, you chose to play that role according to your interests, but you leveraged the United States. There was a time that from 1953, 54, maybe 56 to 66, you were the highest recipient of aids from both the superpowers. Why were you able to do that? Not because you were clever, but because you had a certain weight that they felt was necessary for their geopolitical images to be in place. Today, that continues to be that your presence in Asia adds some weight. But if you're going to topple over and just simply lend it and become another Australia or another, then you've lost that power. So the power of being in the interstices of the balance of power only will persist if you maintain your strategic autonomy. Otherwise, you've lost it.
All right. I think on that note, I should just thank all our panelists for being here. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Hamid Ansari, for setting us off on this very interesting discussion. And thank you for being a great audience.
It's a great book. Thank you so much. It really is a great book. It's a great book. Really is.
Ambassador Menon